Welcome to Voices in the Wilderness, conversations about church and leader health. Thank you so much for listening. We encourage you to keep the conversation going. Voices in the Wilderness is brought to you by Preparing for Amazement Ministries, where we empower and equip churches and leaders to create lasting and transformational health. Visit amazed15.org to learn more. We also welcome any comments or suggestions. Simply email us at podcast@amazed15.org. My name is Marcus Carlson, and today our guest is Jen Binford. Welcome, Jen.
Well, hello.
All right, we got like all of us here. You know, it's always good when the technology does what we'd like it to. Now, you've been on the podcast before, and you're one of our coaches with the ministry, but specifically today, I want to talk a little bit about the work that you're doing with your Doctor of Ministry. So tell us a little bit about that work that you're doing. I know you just finished a big presentation, so tell us a little more.
Yeah, so even how I came into this ministry is learning that church health is not just about church health broadly, it's about leader health, and have been researching and studying for years, really, how we are where we are today. And there are some very disturbing research statistics about the state of pastors and ministry leaders, which is causing some of the division in the church today. And so, what I have done as well, some of those statistics, for example, are that 33% of our pastors are seriously considering quitting, according to Barna, as well as 60% doubting their calling. We have 27% experiencing frequent emotional and mental exhaustion, and 46% saying that they sometimes are experiencing that. We also have most of our pastors and ministry leaders experiencing, at least half of them, some form of isolation, either frequently or sometimes. And the most disturbing research statistic that I found out more recently is that 1 in 6 of our pastors and ministry leaders are considering harming themselves or thoughts of suicide, and that's within the last year. And so the statistics and the state of where we are with our spiritual leaders is disturbing. And so what I've been looking at is Shalom resilience, and that's a term I coined to help ministry leaders and shepherds, our pastors, understand what it is that is the deep longing within them, and have designed a learning experience to help begin attunement for a sense of shalom resilience, that to begin developing some tools and skills to help experience peace-filled perseverance to sustain in ministry.
Yeah, and resilience, that's an important word, obviously, and I think sometimes has negative connotations or this assumption that by telling somebody they need to develop resilience, that they're not resilient or weak. But the reality is that doing anything, especially ministry in today's world, requires a lot more resilience than it used to.
Right. And it's not just something that just happens, or it's not like a quality of who you are, like a trait. You either have it or you don't. It's actually something you have to grow in your ability to be able to do. And it requires some mental fitness tools. It requires understanding a little bit about how your brain and body was designed. And really, through American culture teaches us grit, as like pull up your bootstraps, as if that's just a choice that we make. It's actually not. And most people don't realize that they're functioning mostly from their autopilot settings. And so you really need to be able to look a little more deeper and be transformed at a deeper level. And over and over and over and over, biblically, we're told, like in 1 Corinthians 10:12, I'm looking down at the workbook that I designed for Shalom Resilient Churches, and I put on the cover, so if you think you're standing firm, be careful that you don't fall, because some of us think that we can just,
Or
I'm just going to
sink.
rise up and stand again. Yeah.
Yeah.
And really, it requires attunement and intentionality, just like parenting. You don't accidentally parent your kids into, I mean, many of us do. If you're not paying attention, you end up with unintentional outcomes. And it's a form of accidental parenting when you're talking about parenting, and it same goes, like that concept applies in this as well. If you're talking about resilience, and really a lighter way to talk about it that maybe isn't so charged with language, is a friend of mine is a pastor in urban Seattle, and his name's Philma, and what he said is that we were taught to preach, but no one ever taught us how to, or equipped us how to sustain in ministry. And all Shalom resilience in like a lighter way is really the ability, which is our through learned skills and awareness and attunement, to actually be able to sustain in ministry so that you can flourish within your calling and not be so doubtful and just heavy and weary all the time.
Yeah. Well, and as I think about resilience, I see a counselor regularly because it's an important part of my mental health. And she said to me one day, she said, "You are incredibly resilient." And I just said, "I'm tired of that sometimes, right?" And most of my resilience was developed out of miserable or difficult or painful situations. Maybe some of my own doing, most not. But and so to see this kind of proactive approach to resilience, I think is really helpful because it could have saved someone like me some pretty serious scars and gray hairs along the way. But obviously, this is a big thing and it's a hard thing. And we're not always good at talking about hard things in the church. So, I'm assuming that's been your experience from what I know of you. But why do you think we struggle to have hard conversations in the church in a healthy way?
Oh, I could go on for days about this, as you know.
Sure, yeah, yeah. Throwing you a softball.
In the most succinct way that I could say this is kind of a broad, a little bit dramatic statement, and that is that most adults in our broader culture are teenagers emotionally and socially. And why is that? Question mark. I would say our culture values knowledge and
Mm.
we value physical health. And because broadly we don't value emotional and social health, we are not taught that ever intentionally or directly by people who may be able to equip us. So, for example, in the elementary schools, more so that we don't have a shared expectations of relational health, and we don't have the tools or the equipping for emotional health nor the social skills to be able to do that, to even value, for example, relational repair. And so the ill equipping broadly as a culture, we're basically discipled into a way of being that the enemy has woven patterns of unhealth to distract, to demean, and to divide us. And we're not even aware of those patterns. And we're just functioning out of our maladaptive behaviors and maladaptive coping strategies for a sense of safety, because God designed us to experience a sense of safety, that we are unintentionally creating unnecessary conflict and unintentionally causing greater harm by leaking onto one another emotionally.
Which
So
is interesting.
basically, in other words, we bring our unhealth that we've learned outside the church to church with us. And it's a new family system. And if you bring unhealthy, maladaptive ways of being into the family system, and then you add theology around it as if that, yeah,
Well, and
spiritualizing
those
it.
new systems are usually, at least in some way, unhealthy themselves, some more so than others. And that, certainly, is a piece of the puzzle as well. And I think a lot of times in the church, as we talk about, like, we avoid the conflict because we think that's the nice Christian thing to do, but it's actually one of the least caring things that we can do for ourselves and for one another.
Exactly. So we're called to be peacemakers, not peacekeepers. And
Mm.
so to actually be a true peacemaker requires intentionality for emotional health. For example, in one local space, I know of a particular individual who was called and labeled divisive over something super simple, and then it turned into this big, elaborate mess. And just a couple blocks away, we have a different, very mature, very aware pastor who travels to a war zone to be a person of peace, a peacemaker. So the level of maturity, it's just extreme difference when um, we're unaware again of our maladaptive narratives and assumptions and expectations and beliefs that we don't even know that we're functioning from, and cause unnecessary harm. And being an actual peacemaker in today's context requires a little more than theology.
For sure. But we like to use theology kind of, I think, and this is a total sidebar, whole nother podcast episode, kind of as a weapon sometimes to maintain our culture. So, what would you say, for the average listener, who goes to their church and maybe may not see all of how the sausage is made, which they're lucky not to. What does it look like in a simple way to have hard conversations in a healthy way in the church? Because I mean, the church is a relational organization. The Christian faith is a relational faith, and so we've got to be able to be in relationship, which inevitably the deeper the relationship, I think, the more you have to have hard conversations. So what does that look like, kind of from your experience and what you've learned so far?
Yeah. So, what I would say is if it is a true conflict, you follow Matthew 18, which is you go to the person directly, you follow the biblical process, which most people don't even know that there's a healthy process. So, you go to the person directly and you talk to them directly, which also requires some skills that I'll mention in a few minutes so that it's actually relational repair, focusing on connection, not being right, and not trying to convince the other. That's another part of our culture that we bring to church with us. The
Especially
second,
in the US. That's not as true in other places, but
yes.
definitely in the US.
So the second step is if the first round doesn't work, then you take one or two people with you, either as a witness or as a mediator. And those are two very different things. And it requires intentionality of how that is done, and also with a very clear posture. And if that doesn't work, then you go to the leadership, which is the final step of tell the church. Now, if the leadership doesn't have the skills to help lead through this, that's a whole other problem. So where I would go back to is leader in order to be healthy churches and to help with this mess, to go all the way up and equip the leaders, which is where my heart is and where I come in. But one of the things that I designed is a perspective lens um, graphic to help with the concept that I would like to share with you. And that is, how do I even know if I'm in a true conflict or not?
Mm.
There's a filter before you step into Matthew 18. And so this is the first graphic I wanted to show. And here's the filter. So the process for Matthew 18 has a filter before you even step into it to choose whether or not, or to discern, I shouldn't say choose, to discern whether or not it's actually conflict. And the first step is to pause and pray, obviously. The second step is to ponder perspective lenses. And I will go into that in a second. But also, is this simply just a personality preference? If it's a personality preference and that person is just too direct for you or too emotional or whatever it is that annoys you, it's not a real conflict, right? So, one thing when we're talking about perspective lenses is just to acknowledge that different people see the world differently. And one of the greatest ways to prevent conflict is to learn the superpower, the relational social fitness superpower, to be able to observe behavior without evaluating it through your own perspective lenses. This is so profound that I'm going to repeat it
Including
because
your
this,
own behavior, not just others, right?
yes,
Yeah.
this will prevent most conflict in your own homes, with your own children, with your friends, in the church. If you are able to observe behavior without evaluating it through your own perspective lenses. Back to also, though, most of us don't recognize what our perspective lenses are. And that's where this graphic that I designed came into play. Woo! So, at the core of our autopilot settings, at the most simple level, you have a narrative that you function from. Some of those are false narratives, some of them are maladaptive, and some are healthy.
Right.
Hopefully, if within the church, you have a biblical narrative, and even within that is a range, right? And then we also have our assumptions, our expectations, and our beliefs, values, and convictions. Please acknowledge there is no other person that shares exactly your same perspective lenses. So that in itself, even just to be aware of, is profound.
Are
So
you
whether
saying
it's
that
your
everyone
spouse,
doesn't see the world exactly as I do?
and to even believe the narrative that our perspectives are healthy or the right perspective is just absolutely prideful and absurd. So there's no person who is fully healthy, who has a all healthy narrative, all healthy expectations, even understands biblical theology. Like we wouldn't have 45,000 denominations if anybody had figured this out, right?
Well, right,
So,
but I mean,
yes.
but to be
So,
fair, like 44,000 of those are Baptists. So, I mean,
yes. So to use the filter is this even a true conflict? Again, the superpower observing behavior without evaluating it, personality preference, and then inviting the spirit into this so it's not a reactive. And then if it is a true conflict, then follow Matthew 18. But when we're following Matthew 18, we need to value relationship and value relational repair. And that's where the second superpower comes into play, that we were designed and wired for connection to God and connection to one another. And this is where shalom, that's a part of shalom, is like at home in God's presence and with one another, experiencing that peace that surpasses understanding and wholeness. And we must value relational repair. And again, our culture has taught us to divide and value being enemies and being right and having the right knowledge, the right positions. That is not biblical. That is not theological. That is American.
right.
And to even acknowledge that and untangle that, I would say is very profound. And then when you go to someone, there's some social skills that are required. You must learn how to deal with whatever is inside of you that is causing you to show up in a way that is not inviting. And it takes a lot of emotional maturity to actually walk through relational repair. And it requires a humble posture where you're regulated, not always perfect, but regulated to be able to communicate in a way that's able to be received. And also to show value to the other person's perspective, not to listen to then tell them why they're wrong, but to actually listen, to be a compassionate witness to their perspective and show it value whether you agree with it or not. That's a very mature ability, a social fitness that you're able to do if you have social intelligence, right?
Yeah.
The other piece of that is just to carry yourself with curiosity and to carry yourself with teachability. 100% you in some way need to shift or learn something or grow, and you're not perfect, nobody is. And so just to acknowledge that we all are responsible and have a little bit of transformation, and that one of the other pieces of this is to rewire and put off the belief or the narrative that conflict is bad. Is
Mm.
actually, it just is.
Well, right, right. And actually, again, for me, some of my best learnings and best relationships and deepening of relationships have come through conflict. And so, yeah, I mean, I get that it's counterintuitive that, if you enjoy conflict, you should probably get some professional help. I get that we're not supposed to like it, but I think that just because, we don't like it, we assume that it's awful and there's no value in it, which, uh, scripture and the life of Jesus and a personal experience kind of tells me is not true. But even I, who do conflict all day long, there are times where I'm like, Uncle, like I want to tap out, just for a couple minutes. And so I think that that's also hard for people too, that it's a pretty conflicted season, at least in North America. And so, I think I can understand the conflict weariness, but that still doesn't solve any of it.
Right. And the conflict weariness is absolutely unnecessary because we get ourselves into unnecessary conflict. And so that's where I want to help equip. Really, the message that I've learned is for all people, but I'm running after the leaders of our churches so that they can spread, right? Shepherds. What my one of my mentors and friends, Dr. Ralph Corner, defines a shepherd's role as going before the people, learning the way, and then pulling them along.
Yeah.
So if we don't have the skills and the ability to actually regulate our emotions, we don't ourselves don't have emotional intelligence or the social fitness tools and equipping, we're not able to lead the flock well. We're actually causing generally a lot of the problem. And one of the things that about the beliefs and values and convictions around conflict in general, or even a narrative that people function from, is that it's to be avoided, or that, again, that there's something wrong with it, or that it's negative in a sense. And actually, without conflict, there isn't change. And
Right.
without conflict, there's often not transformation. It is part of the human experience. And I would go on to say, like, it's part of how we are transformed as followers of Jesus. So without it, you're not going to be transformed.
For
And
sure. It,
to see it as like a redemptive, beautiful part of our journey, and the people that I have gone into conflict with and have relationally repaired, like, our human connection and relationship is stronger and
deeper.
healthier
Yes.
and
Yeah.
deeper.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, and Jesus was no stranger to conflict. He had conflict with religious people, he had conflict with his friends, he had conflict with the government. He was no stranger, to conflict. He had conflict with his situation, even in the Garden of Gethsemane, right? And so, we see this over and over again. Jen, this is super helpful stuff. I think we'll need to find time to do, another episode to dive a little more into this and love kind of some of those images that you shared, and maybe we'll find a way to make those available to folks as well for that are just listening or didn't catch all those in the video.
Sweet. Of course.
Awesome. Always good to have you on.
Thank you. Always a delight.
Again, thank you for listening. We encourage you to keep this conversation going. Voices in the Wilderness is brought to you by Preparing for Amazement Ministries, where we empower and equip churches and leaders to create lasting and transformational health. Visit amazed15.org to learn more. And again, we welcome any comments or suggestions. Simply email us at podcast@amazed15.org.